Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the Rutgers Cooperative Extension Earth Day at Home webinar series. We are very excited to present the first in our series. This is getting to the root of soil compaction. But before we get started, I just wanted to go over a couple things. I am Amy Rowe. I am the environmental agent for Essex and Passaic counties in Rutgers Cooperative Extension, and I am joined by Steve Yergeau, who will introduce in a minute. But what we are doing here with our webinar series is just having Earth Day at home, since we can't enjoy the 50th anniversary of Earth Day events that we normally have. So we are going to do a webinar series showing you guys what you can do at home to be more sustainable and some actions that you can take to be as environmentally friendly as possible from your comfort of your home, your yard, your landscape. So we have a whole list of webinars that you guys can participate in. We'll be meeting every Monday at 6:30 p.m. And so if you're not familiar with Rutgers Cooperative Extension, we are the outreach arm of the university. We bring the research from the university out into the local level. There is an extension office in nearly every county in the state. We're missing Hudson. We do have a presence there despite not having an office. So we work at the local level to bring science and research out to people at the local level in your community. And we are focusing on Earth Day and sustainability here for this webinar series. So before we get started, just wanted to go over some things about WebEx. So everyone is muted. We are keeping you muted throughout the program just so that we can keep control of our series here. So if you have a question, you're going to want to use the chat box. There is a blue chat bubble in the top right of the main screen, so you can click on that and you can type right into your chat box there. Make sure you send it to all participants in the drop-down menu. So we will be taking questions via chat only. You will not be able to unmute yourself. So we will be asking questions as we move along. And so don't be shy. Please make sure that you ask your questions and our speaker will get to them as soon as he can. So some other things. As I said, you are muted on entry, so we'll handle that. But also we will be doing some polling so that you guys can answer some questions for us. And so look for the poll about 10 minutes before the end of this session. You will fill out some questions for us just so that we know how we're doing, so we know what you learned, and if you have any suggestions. So look for that at the end of the webinar, and we will get going with that. And so without any further ado, I will introduce our speaker. So today we have Steve Yergeau. He is the environmental agent for Ocean and Atlantic counties, with Rutgers Cooperative Extension. And so he is here today to talk about soil compaction and how to prevent soil compaction, because the soil is the most important part of your landscape. And so Steve has been working on soil compaction and soil compaction education for a while now, and so we're very lucky to have him to start off our Earth Day at Home webinar series. So I will hand it off to Steve. Thank you, Steve. Welcome.
No problem. Thank you, Amy. Just hand the ball over to me. So tonight, as Amy said, we're going to be talking about soil compaction and getting to the root of it. We figured that the best way to kick off our Earth Day series was to actually talk about Earth. So we're going to talk about soil. And the whole point of this Earth Day at Home series is really to take the motto of Earth Day, which was thinking globally but acting locally, and figuring out a way that we could do it for the 50th anniversary in the current situation that we have. So currently our local environment is restricted to basically our houses, so we figured we'd talk to people about what they can do at home to actually be more sustainable, be environmentally friendly on a variety of topics. So some of the topics that are being covered for the next few weeks include, soil health and soil compaction, but also composting, having an environmentally friendly yard, how you can figure out what's going on in your environment from home, using some web tools, et cetera. So we have a whole host of different topics to talk to you guys about. But as I said, I'm going to be talking to you tonight about soil compaction. As Amy said, I'm the county agent for environmental and natural resources down in Ocean and Atlantic counties. Most of the work that I've been doing in soil compaction has been down in that neck of the woods. So when I'm talking about soil tonight, I'm going to try and be as generic as possible and not talking specifically about Ocean County, but compaction can actually be a problem in soils if they get less than healthy. So the idea is hopefully by tonight you'll have some tools and some tricks to actually determine whether or not you have soil compaction in your yard. Soil compaction in your yard, and actually whether or not what you can do about it to prevent it from happening or to correct it if you do have soil compaction. So once again, I just want to thank everybody for being here tonight and participating in this. We're really looking forward to this Earth Day at Home series and moving forward. Look it forward this way. Okay. So basically what I'm going to be talking to you guys tonight is soil compaction, but I do want to kind of give you guys not a warning, but kind of a caveat in that my background has primarily been in water resource management and watershed management, and I'm not a true quote-unquote soil scientist. But as Amy mentioned, I've been dealing with soil, and particularly compaction, for probably about 5 or 6 years now. But I look at it not from a soil scientist perspective, but from a water perspective. So what are some of the problems that you can get due to not being able to infiltrate water in the ground due to compaction, et cetera. So I'll be one of the things I'll be talking about later and how soil compaction affects soil health. But basically, this is the outline for this evening's talk. Talk to you guys about what actually is soil compaction, what does it mean, how does it get started, and what causes it. Also, how does soil compaction affect soil health? As Amy said, the basis for our yards and our landscape is basically having healthy soils. So how does soil compaction actually affect that and cause soil health to not be so healthy? So how can you figure out whether or not you have soil compaction is another topic we'll be covering. Also, what to do when you have, or if you find out that you do have compacted soil. So we will be giving you some tips and some ways to actually determine if you have soil compaction in your yard, but then also what you can actually do about it to help alleviate it or prevent it from starting in the first place. So the first place to start is to figure out what soil compaction is. So what is soil compaction? And we have a lovely picture of some clayey, sandy soils from down in Ocean County. But basically what we're talking about with soil compaction is an adverse effect in terms of the soil getting harder due to some factors that influence it. But I did want to kind of take a step backwards because I didn't want to assume that everybody knows what actually makes up soil. And this is actually key to figuring out, what soil compaction is. So in this pie chart, I have what would be considered the ideal proportions of the different components that make up soil. So in the soil, if you were to go out into your yard and actually dig up some of the soil, just a reminder, it is soil and not dirt. Dirt is a dirty word. One of the things I found out from a soil scientist is that it is soil when it's outside, but it's dirt when it comes in your house. Since we're talking about the outside of your home, we're going to be calling it soil. So when we're talking about what actually makes up the different parts of soil, you can see that roughly about half of it, or 45% of soil, is considered the mineral content. So this is the sands, the silts, the clays, the actual mineral portion, the broken down rock as it gets finer and smaller portion of soil that generally people tend to think of when they think about soil. So if I were to ask people, what kind of soil do you have? People would be like, I have sandy soil, I have clayey soil, I have silty soil. This is the portion we're talking about, and it roughly makes about half, a little bit less, 45%, in this kind of idealized section of soil that we're talking about. Also found within soil is water. So, the soil can be moist. It has been raining for the past couple of days in central New Jersey in particular, where I'm at, but you can have some moisture within the soil. And that hopefully, in a balanced soil would make up about a quarter of the overall fraction of the soil. So that 25% of the soil would be water. The other 25% would be air. So there is air in soil. There are organisms that live in the soil that need air to breathe. They need the oxygen to breathe. And so there is air in there that makes all these little pore spaces and cracks and crevices that the water can move through, that air can move through, that plant roots can move through, etc. And then we have a small fraction that's considered organic matter. So this is like broken down plant material, it's broken down organic material that actually provides nutrients like carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus for the soils so that the organisms that live within it, from the very small like bacteria to all the way up to like worms and voles and moles, can actually survive off of while living in the soil. So this basic concept of what makes up the soil, the composition of soil, is really kind of key. And the reason that it's key is when we're defining compaction, what compaction really is it's a hardening of soil, but it's due to the loss of the air component of the soil. So it's not like you're squeezing out the water. It's not like you're packing in additional solid material like the mineral content or the organic matter. But really what you're doing is you're pressing out the air that's found in those pore spaces in the soil. So basically you're squeezing all the air out of soil and it makes the soil harder. If you look at the bottom of this slide, you can see that you have a proportion of the air, water, and solid material in the center part of the graphic. But then when you actually have compaction occurring and it actually pushes down on the soil components, you can see on the right-hand side that the only thing that changes is that amount of air. So you have less air within it. So it doesn't change the amount of water, it doesn't change the amount of solid material that's in it. If you were changing the amount of water that's in the components of soil, you'd actually be just drying the soil, and you'd have a situation that may not be healthy for plants because there's not enough water for them to survive, etc. One of the other things to keep in mind is that when we actually do soil compaction measurements and do a more technical definition of soil compaction, what we're talking about is an increase in the soil bulk density. So remember, it's a loss of the air that's within that component of the soil matrix. So you're still retaining the water and the solid, but you're increasing the soil bulk density. So what do we basically mean when we're saying, oh, we're increasing the soil bulk density? Well, bulk density is a measurement that's done for soils, and it's basically the weight of a certain amount of soil over that volume of soil. So in the example here in this graphic, it says in terms of the soil being made up of the solids and the pore spaces and that water component, let's assume that we have 1 cubic centimeter of soil. So we have a cube that's 1 centimeter on each side. So it's 1 cubic centimeter. That 1 cubic centimeter weighs 1.33 grams. So we take the weight, which is the 1.33 grams, and we divide it by the volume, which is 1. So then our bulk density would be 1.33 grams per cubic centimeter. So that's bulk density. So you can imagine that bulk density would increase as you get heavier soil in the same amount of space. And how do you get that heavier soil? Well, you lose the air. So what I mean by that is, what does air weigh? It's virtually nothing. What you can actually determine from this is that you have less air, so you're losing basically that no weight to it, but you're packing in more of those particles that make up the mineral portion. So you have more sands, more silts, more clays coming in. So you're actually increasing the weight, but you're not changing the volume. So therefore, your bulk density increases. So you have heavier soil in a smaller amount of space, hence you have hardening of the soil, you have the compaction that you see, an increase in bulk density, and then you're actually dealing with some compaction issues that are there. So it's a way of us measuring out in the field whether or not there is compaction, but there's other ways to measure whether or not you have compaction or to determine if you have it as well. So we'll get into those in a little bit later. So in Ocean County, the Soil Conservation District for Ocean County actually did a survey a few years ago, I think about 10 years ago, and looking at different land uses and what the soil bulk density was for the different land uses. So you can see in this graphic here are the 4 different landscape types. We have undisturbed lands, which includes forests and woodlands, and their bulk density was determined to be about 1.03 grams per cubic centimeter. So it's that bulk density I just mentioned, it's about 1. So the weight of the soil is approximately the same as the volume of the soil, which is seen as pretty good bulk density. It doesn't seem to be compacted, it could be a healthier soil, etc. Then we start looking at residential neighborhoods in the upper right, and golf courses, parks, and other managed Okay, I thought I shared the file. I see a couple of people are saying they can't actually see the slides.
Yeah, Steve, I think you're okay. I think it's just their settings on their side.
Okay.
They've just set it up so they can just see your face.
Okay. Well, I hope you enjoy that as well. So. Thank you, Michelle. So as I was saying, we have the undisturbed lands where there hasn't been much management of the landscape at about 1 gram per cubic centimeter for the bulk density. And then we have residential neighborhoods and golf courses, parks, and athletic fields, which are basically managed areas. So, people manage their lawns in residential areas. Golf courses, parks, and athletic fields are also managed to maintain a certain look or aesthetic, depending on what their uses are for. And you can see that the bulk densities are about the same. It's about 1.7 to almost 2 in terms of bulk density. So we're going a little bit higher, a little bit more compacted soil. And then I don't know who the poor intern was who had to go out and measure what the bulk density of concrete was, but they determined that concrete has a bulk density of about 2.2 grams per cubic centimeter. And so that is an impervious surface. Water's not going to get through it. It's solid. It's considered, a solid material, so it is heavily compacted, and it can have some problems in terms of, paving over certain areas. Actually, covering up areas that would have groundwater recharge, et cetera, which can actually be problematic with compacted areas. But you can see if you have a managed system like a golf course or a residential neighborhood that starts to creep up closer to what concrete is, you can see that there might be problems that can come from that because, you have these compacted soils where, you're going to run into some of the physical properties being affected and some of the chemical properties, and even the biological diversity will be affected as well. So this was just to give you guys a range of bulk densities. From what I've seen in the field and from some of the research that's out there, 2.2 to 2.4 is about the highest bulk density we can get to. So you can basically cram in twice as much of a weight of the material in the same space. And that's kind of the maximum that you can kind of put into the bulk density measurements in compacting the soil. But one of the things I want to stress is that when we're talking about bulk density and compaction, and we're talking about lawns, it really isn't a problem that affects just the surface of the lawn. So it's not just where your lawn is growing or where your plants are growing. It can actually be within the subsoil or further down the soil profile. So this is just a graphic showing the depth and the bulk densities that go with it. So you can see that the bulk densities start out at about 1.43. They go further down to 1.9, then 1.7, 1.6. They jump around from being compacted to not compacted. So even though some of the things I'm going to talk to you tonight might be just determining within the first foot or so of your yard, whether or not you have compaction, just realize that it could be a deeper problem as well if it's been a long-term managed landscape in terms of, how long the development's been there, how long, say, you live on a farm, how long it's been active as a farm, et cetera. So this is something I just want you guys to be aware of, is that compaction isn't something that just happens at the surface of your yard or the surface of the soil. It can actually happen further down in the soil profile itself.
Excuse me,
yeah.
Steve. There's a question, how do you measure bulk density?
How do you measure bulk density? Okay, let me go back a couple of slides. So when you're measuring bulk density, what you do is you get a known volume of soil. So say like, we like the metrics in science, so we're going to go with grams, but it could be a weight of something. So you can get like a pound of soil. You can get a weight of, a weight of the soil. You get a certain amount. But then you would also need to know what the volume is. So when I've seen bulk density measured in the field, what they usually do is they take something that looks like probably about a 2 or 3 inch long section of a pipe that's maybe about 4 inches in diameter, and they pound that into the ground, and they take it out, and they get basically a section of soil that looks like what you would think of a cat food can or a tuna can shape. And they know what the volume of that is based upon the size of the ring of that cutoff pipe that they were able to pound in the ground and pull out that section. And then what they'll do is they'll actually weigh that as well. Sometimes they'll do it after drying the soil, so they actually get rid of that water that's in the soil. So basically you're just getting the mineral portion and the organic portion that's within it. So you basically would just get out a section of the soil of a known volume through some sort of round device to actually take out that slice, weigh it, and then you would use this formula in terms of the weight of the soil, of that volume of soil, to determine the bulk density. So obviously, the more stuff that's packed into a small space, the heavier it's going to be, so the higher the bulk density. So what you want is basically what I would call light, fluffy soil, which has a lot of air within it to help alleviate that weight, so you can actually have it be less compacted, et cetera.
Hey,
Yep.
Steve. Thank you. One more
Go ahead.
question. Will you explain why residential neighborhoods have such compacted soil? Is it due to the grading and construction, and will therefore depend partly on the age of the neighborhood?
Yeah, that's part of it. Bear in mind that these are basically based upon just the straight land uses, and it doesn't take into account, well, this is why they have ranges. It doesn't take into account like particulars of the soil texture, et cetera. So, you know, if you have loamy soils versus sandy soils, et cetera. So it could be based upon the fact that within these managed systems, whether it's residential neighborhoods or golf courses and parks, that there is construction that happens beforehand. When I'm talking about soil compaction in terms of being an environmental problem, it's because of the impact it has on the environment. But compaction in a residential area happens, you know, for engineering reasons. So they are going to compact a soil to ensure that the structure that they're building stands and stays. So I'm not against that. But because they do have to put an engineering compaction into a constructed area. It's the surrounding lands around the house that we're really talking about. So your yard, your front yard, your backyard, your landscape areas, what can you do to help alleviate these? So when you have this kind of compaction occurring, it's usually due to the construction practices. It can have an effect from the age of the development, so older developments can have more settling. It can also due to the fact that the type of soil that they bring in, if they bring in a fill as opposed to using the natural soils that were there, and they pack that down, that can have an impact on it as well. So it can have all those kind of factors that go into it. All right, thank you, Amy, for the questions. So basic, and thank you guys for those questions as well. So we know, hopefully, you know, after that quick introduction, we do have an idea of what soil compaction is. So what actually causes compaction? I started to mention a little bit of what goes into causing soil compaction, talking about construction, et cetera. So basically, soil compaction is started by having repetitive wheel or foot traffic go over soil over a long period of time. So bear in mind that when I'm talking about environmental compaction, it's basically people walking over an area or vehicles driving over an area over a long period of time. So it's a slow process that happens over a long period of time. The engineering compaction I talked about before uses things like steamrollers or handheld compactors to pack down the soil very quickly so that they can actually put a structure on it and maintain the stability of that structure. But in terms of compaction in the environment, we're talking about repetitive wheel or foot traffic going on soil. If the area is agricultural and it has livestock, you can also say hoof or paw traffic for this as well. So you can have animals that are compacting soil down as well. One of the things to keep in mind when compaction occurs is that soil is the most compactable when it's at the moisture content that's called field capacity. And this is when those pore spaces or that idealized composition of soil I showed you at the beginning is made up where it's half filled with water and half filled with air. So when the soil seems to be the healthiest in terms of having this balance between half of the soil being mineral content and the other half being a quarter water and quarter air, that's also when the soil can actually be at risk of getting compacted the most. So we want this field capacity, which is great for plants to grow in, it's great for the organisms that live in the soil to thrive, but it really can be like heavily impacted by compaction if you have this continuous wheel or foot traffic going over it. So field capacity, I like to call, is kind of our Goldilocks scenario. So it's not too much, it's not too little, it's just right. So if you were to have those air or water components be more or less than half, and you have the soil that's saturated because there's too much water, it's difficult to compact that because the water is what's filling the pore spaces. So basically you just have mud. And if you've tried to compress or squeeze mud, it just kind of oozes through your fingers and there's really no way to compact that. But then if you kind of shift it on the other side where you have too much air in the soil, it's too dry, there's too much air to remove, so it can't really compact. So that you can actually run into problems by having too much air, can't really compact it. It can happen over a long period of time if you have a long drought situation, there's no water getting through the soil, but really on the face of it and in terms of generic terms, if you have too much water or too much air, the soil is less compactable. It's really that sweet spot of that field capacity.
Hey, Steve.
Yes.
There's a question. There's actually two questions.
Mm-hmm.
What you don't show here is urban soil, which often has fill that's
Mm-hmm.
environmentally suspect.
Yeah. Yes.
I guess that's more of a comment than sure.
Questions. Yes.
And then there's also a question, how about sandy soil versus clay soil? Not exactly sure what the context is.
In terms of maybe their compactability and their compressibility. So in terms of trying to keep this slightly more generic, when you're talking about compaction, it's really going to depend on what pore spaces are available. Because remember, compaction is the loss of those air spaces by pulling all those mineral particles together. So when you're talking about compaction, the mineral content, it will have an influence on it. And what I mean by mineral content is it mostly sand? Is it mostly clay, et cetera? It's not that much of an influence, and I'll give you, except in these cases in a second. It's mostly has to do with the amount of pore spaces you have, because that's really what you're going to have to push together to get that higher bulk density in that compacted soil. So now here's the exceptions. If you have a soil that's overwhelmingly clay, it's basically going to be solid like Play-Doh or modeling clay. There are so many soil particles in terms of clay, because they're so small, packed together, that in essence they are of themselves basically a compact layer. So if you think of like modeling clay or Play-Doh, water's not getting through it, it's going to be heavily compacted. Overly clay soils are going to be problematic for that particular reason. Once again, I'm looking at this from a water perspective. It's not going to allow infiltration, et cetera. Sandy soils have a little bit more drainage because they're a little bit larger particles than the clay soils. So if you look at this graphic where I have wilting point on the right-hand side, you can kind of think of that as your sandy soil. You have more pore spaces, more air flowing through it, more space for excess water to drain through it. But that doesn't mean that sandy soils can't compact. They're very difficult to compact. If anybody who has been on a beach and if the beach is slightly wet after, say, like a tide comes in and you've fallen on it, it can feel like concrete sometimes. So it's a nice hard substance that can pull together. Not the same in terms of exactly being the same for compaction, but sandy soils can compact as well, but it's a little bit more effort because they have those extra pore spaces. So like I said before, because they have those extra pore spaces, they have more air, it's slightly more difficult to get all that air out to fully compact it. Whereas the clay soils are more like the saturation part of this picture I'm showing you, in that they're already compressed together and they're not going to allow any water to go through, et cetera. So that's the difference between the different soil types that are out there. So obviously the level of compaction is going to be on the level of effort that goes into compacting the soil in terms of the wheel and foot traffic, also the amount of moisture, but also the soil texture itself. So if it's sandy or clay, et cetera. So there's a whole host of factors that go into determining whether or not a soil will be compacted. But just in general, moisture content is really one of the higher influences on soil compaction. Hopefully I answered the question. But when looking at the field capacity, as I mentioned before, it is kind of our Goldilocks scenario. It's just right. The wilting point has too much air in it. It's not wet enough. The plants that grow in it will actually start to wilt, hence the name wilting point. Saturation is too much water. It's just basically mud. Unless a plant likes that, it's not going to grow well. Unless an organism likes that, it's not going to thrive there. But that field capacity, we can see that you have all these pore spaces that are about 25% of that block, and then you have 25% of the blue area, which represents the water. You can see that that's kind of our sweet spot where you can kind of mush those guys a little bit closer together in terms of those soil particles and actually have the compaction start to occur at that point. So here are just some of the causes of compaction. You know, I mentioned wheel traffic, hoof traffic, and also you can see foot traffic. In the picture I was showing the people hiking, you know, on the right-hand side, you can actually see the footpath that's been carved out by people walking back and forth. You can pretty much guess at that point that that could be compacted. On the upper left, we have some off-road vehicles that are driving through some sandy soils. If they go off-roading, they can actually influence the compaction levels of those. And also at the bottom, in agricultural areas I mentioned before, You can have animals or livestock that are walking through an area, and some pastures can get compacted because of that. And obviously, with those animals being larger and heavier, they can have a longer-term impact and can actually have compaction occur more quickly because of their size and their weight going back and forth. But as I mentioned before, it's not just this movement back and forth, but basically how we treat the land as well. On the upper left here, we've got some construction activity that's actually happening in the rain. So basically that soil is pretty much near field capacity, so it will lead to some problems where it actually could potentially become compacted by having this heavy machinery go back and forth. Also, with agricultural areas, compaction is a big problem because it affects the plant growth, it affects their bottom line because they're trying to grow these crops to make a living. So having heavy machinery going over the same area back and forth, there's some strategies that they use in agriculture to help alleviate that. But even in the upper right, just mowing, using large machinery going back and forth on areas, whether it's a large park area. I live in a townhouse development. We have our guys come, I think, once every week or once every other week, and they're riding the mowers and they're going back and forth in these small areas. So they are actually causing some compaction by going back and forth. Just remember that this is a long process that happens depending on how often it's managed and depending on how heavy the equipment is that's being used to manage these areas. So the bigger the equipment, the heavier, the quicker it'll compact it, and also the number of passes going back and forth in an area can actually increase the rate of compaction occurring. So that's what compaction is. That's what causes compaction. Now, what are some of the effects that we have from compaction? So what does compaction actually do to the soil environment, et cetera? So if you guys have any other questions, feel free to keep them coming. Amy, you're doing a great job. Let me know. We've got some questions. So what are some of the effects from compaction? After we know what compaction is, we know what causes it. So what are some of the effects that happen in the soil environment due to compaction? So as I mentioned, I'm a water guy, so I look at this from a water perspective. So that's the first thing I'm going to talk to you guys about. So with compacted soils, they become hard. They also become more dense because that bulk density increases. And because you're losing those pore spaces, you're going to lose that porosity. So think of a sponge that's basically having all the little nooks and crannies in that sponge being filled up by little particles and kind of clogging that sponge. That's going to prevent water from filtering through it. It's going to be inhibited, and you're actually going to increase erosion. So I think a lot of people would in their head be like, hey, that's kind of counterintuitive that you have this soil that's being compacted together. It's becoming harder. But then you're saying, hey, it's more likely to actually erode. Well, that's because you have water, like in this picture, building up on the surface, causing some flooding, loosening up some of the particles that might not be compacted, and actually increasing the amount of stormwater runoff that you get in an area. So if you have compacted soils, they'll start to act more like that concrete I showed you before, where it won't allow water to percolate through it or to infiltrate through, and will actually increase the amount of flooding, increase the amount of runoff from an area, which actually can increase the amount of erosion of the topsoil that you have. And obviously that's bad for a farmer, but that's also bad for your yard and your lawn because you're losing those precious areas where the topsoil has a lot of nutrients for your plants to grow. So this is just a graphic showing, water going to a non-compacted layer of soil, which overlays a compacted layer of soil. So when you have rainfall or water or irrigation happening in an area on a non-compacted soil, it's going to actually infiltrate and go into the non-compacted soil on our top layer. So these down arrows are going into the soil. But when it hits the compacted layer, it's got nowhere to go except it will go back up and it will actually pond on the surface like on these pictures on the bottom here, or it will actually start to move across that compacted layer. And that's where that increased erosion comes in. Because this top layer is not compacted, it's all loose and fluffy, any water flowing through it will carry off parts of that water and actually cause you to lose some of that topsoil and increase sedimentation in local waterways, et cetera, and have you lose basically part of your yard if you have compacted soil in the yard. So one of the things that you can check for, and I'll mention this later on, is to see if you have compacted soils, is to see if there's any ponding of water in your yard. If you have water ponding there, that might indicate that you have compacted soil in that particular area.
Hey, Steve.
Yep.
Can you address the difference between compaction versus erosion in determining the change in soil or a problematic area?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that for me, please?
Can you address the difference between compaction versus erosion in determining the change in soil or a problematic area?
So in terms of a change in soil, you're talking about what is actually changing the soil from the compaction or from the erosion? Is that the gist that I'm getting from?
I think.
So when we're talking about compaction, what we're talking about is like the particles in that soil, the mineral components being brought closer together and making that soil harder. When we're talking about erosion, we're talking about those kind of breaking up and flaking off, whether or not they're compacted. So if it's not compacted, it'll still have some pore spaces. The water will get in there and actually expand those pore spaces and kind of pull apart the soil, the mineral portion of the soil, as I mentioned before. So they're kind of two opposite effects. So when you're talking about a change in soil, what you're doing is basically going from compaction, increasing the bulk density, and erosion basically breaking down that bulk density and losing it and making that fluffy soil that's kind of light and airy and will get washed away. So they're kind of two different opposite processes happening. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. So since we're making the soil denser, for not just water to move through, but also the plants that are growing in there are going to have a difficult time of having their roots grow through the hard soils. The only way that the plant roots will grow through a hardened soil from compaction is if they can find some cracks or some macro pores from previous roots or a tunnel, say, made by some sort of animal like an earthworm or a mole or a vole, or, you know, heaven forbid, a groundhog. I know the dreaded groundhog can actually make large macro pores, giant holes in the soil. That can be followed by those plant roots. So sometimes you can see on the surface of the soil, you can see roots actually growing on the surface and kind of wrapping their way around the tree, making like a circular pattern, because they're just unable to actually build up enough pressure as they're growing to poke through and break through the compacted soil. So with the soil getting so hard like concrete and being solid, it can actually cause problems for the plants to actually have their roots be unable to grow. And obviously this affects the overall health of the tree. If it doesn't have healthy root systems, if it has shallow root systems, it's going to affect the tree. If it has a shallow root system that's just on the surface, a big windstorm or a heavy rainstorm can actually knock it over. If you think of those trees after windstorms, flopped over and they just have these giant roots at the bottom holding onto a little bit of a thin layer of soil. This is kind of what can happen if the soil is compacted enough and the roots can't grow through it. So root growth is affected by, soil compaction because the roots simply can't go through it because it's just way too hard for the plant to build up enough pressure to actually have healthy root systems grow.
Hey, Steve.
Yeah.
Can you go back to the tree picture, please?
Sure.
So with this picture, how do you know that you're looking at compaction rather than erosion?
Okay. We'll get to the methods to determine that later on. If this is something that's in your yard, you would just have to kind of keep an eye on it over time. In a case like this, you would have to kind of take a shovel or some other implement to the soil to see how hard it is. If it is relatively loose, then you can say, hey, it's erosion. One of the other things to keep in mind out there there are plants and trees and shrubs that naturally grow shallow roots. So you have to know what plant is growing there as well. So you have to keep that in mind. So it could be either compaction or you're having erosion loss from the from a rainstorm or a windstorm due to loose soil, or it could be the type of tree that you have growing there. So really what you have to do is literally and figuratively dig into the soil to find out whether or not you have erosion or compaction going on. Okay. So because the roots get impacted by the level of compaction, it has an impact on the types of plants that can grow there, and it can actually reduce the diversity of plants that you can grow in an area, naturally occurring or whether or not planted. So if you have compacted soils, you're going to basically run into a situation where only certain types of plants will be able to survive and thrive, and you can basically have your yard or your lawn or your landscape turn into just a monoculture of just the same plant, the same shrub, the same tree growing in an area. And I like this graphic because it shows you as you go from the left to the right, you have you have higher bulk density down to less bulk density, and you're increasing the pore spaces and that soil porosity in the soil. And along the top, you can see more plants are growing. So basically, by having more pore spaces, more water, more air flowing through the system, less compaction going on, less bulk density, you're going to have a healthier soil, and you'll be able to grow a larger variety of things in your landscape. So one of the things you want to keep in mind is by having compacted soils and then alleviating that, you're going to actually make it healthier for the plants to grow in, and you'll have a variety of plants. And bear in mind that over the long term, as you have these more healthy plants and a nice variety of them growing in an area, they'll actually work long term to help keep your soils from going back to having compaction as well. So any actions you take are helping to move you forward to have a healthier lawn system and a healthier plant system, et cetera. And that not only affects the plants that are growing in it and the diversity of the plants that are growing on it, but also the diversity of organisms that live in the soil themselves. You'll have a host of organisms in terms of insects and bacteria and fungi and worms, et cetera, growing in it, living in the soil, when you have less compacted soil. So it's not just the diversity of the plants, it's the diversity of the animals that live there as well. So this is just a food web showing what eats what and what's going on. So this is kind of our idealized healthy soil, diversity of organisms that are in there. And one of the things to keep in mind is it's not just the organisms that live in the soil that rely on the soil themselves, but there's also other organisms that rely on the organisms that live in a soil. So here we have a robin feeding its young, an insect that it got from a yard and got from the soil. So it's not just an effect of just the soil health, but even just larger ecological and ecosystem health by maintaining a healthy soil system with a diversity of plants growing in it, a diversity of organisms living within the soil, and also the organisms that don't live in the soil but rely on what comes out of it, like the bird that's seen here. So it's all kind of interconnected in terms of maintaining healthy soil will help to maintain a larger ecosystem in your yard. We do have somebody coming up in a couple of weeks talking about planting habitat for other organisms, so it's all connected in terms of soil health and the plants you put in and the wildlife that you can attract to it, et cetera. So those are just some of the effects that you can have from having compaction. So compaction is going to have that negative impact on the ecosystem and the organisms that live in it and the types of organisms that you can have in it. And also key to that is the amount of water that's getting into the soil through the lack of infiltration, et cetera. So here's some of the things that you guys can do at home. So this is the DIY portion of it, do it yourself at home. So this is the at-home portion of the Earth Day at Home. So what are some of the signs of compaction and what can you guys check for? I will tell you guys that we will make sure to send out a PDF of these slides so you can have these references for later on and use these as resources. And the last slide also includes my email address. So if you have any questions, you can follow up with that. So what are some of the things that you can look for when you're looking for compaction? So first and foremost, one of the things you can check for are anywhere that you have high traffic, lots of footpaths, lots of walking, areas of exposed soil where you have no plants growing and you can kind of see where people have been moving back and forth. And I both like and I hate these photos. I like these photos because they clearly show compaction in the footpaths. You can see where people are walking back and forth. And I hate these photos because they're from the Environmental Sciences building at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. So even outside the Environmental Sciences building, you can see that this happens. So you can see some footpaths on the left here leading out to what's basically the waiting area for the bus at Rutgers. So you can see the students going back and forth, and they've worn down this path. And these are compacted soil. So when I was up on campus, I tested these pathways. They are compacted. It is a problem. There's no plants growing in it. You cut the diversity down to basically nothing by having just bare soil. So one of the things you can look for are heavily trafficked areas that have footpaths worn into them and also have exposed soil and no plants growing in it. Could be one of the things you look for. One of the things I'll remind everybody is these could also be indicative of other problems besides compaction. So obviously you want to do a check of whether or not there's compaction or other soil tests that you can do, et cetera, to determine what's going on with the soil. So in addition to looking for the footpaths, you can look for those surface and shallow roots that I mentioned before. So same photo as before. If you see these surface or shallow roots, you can kind of say, hey, there might be compaction going on. The roots aren't able to grow through the soil. They're not able to grow down into the ground. But you also want to look for areas where there's no plants growing that are not part of a footpath or a walkway, etc. So on the left here, we have some grass areas where there's nothing growing, and it could be due to compaction. It's not a known footpath that you don't see any regular pattern going back and forth of a walkway, etc. So look for those areas where you kind of have patchy soil showing through, patchy grasses growing, patchy plants growing, etc. So the surface and shallow roots and those areas where there's no plants growing because the soil is just so hard for the roots to grow through. So that's something else that you can check for at home. And the other thing I mentioned before is because of the lack of infiltration, you can look for areas where water ponds at the surface. These two photos are the same photos I showed you before. They are from Georgian Court University in Lakewood in Ocean County. They had a problem with compaction, primarily due to the building of the dormitories. You can see in the background of those photos. So they did have a lot of water ponding on the surface. So they planted all these trees to help alleviate that and hopefully have the trees suck up that extra water. But you can see how well that's working because they're still getting water ponding on the surface. So with the harder soils, you're not getting that infiltration. You're getting more water ponding at the surface, which, if extensive enough, could lead to excess flooding. It could actually lead to loss of plants because they are basically being drowned out by the excess water that's in the area, et cetera. And obviously, no roots can grow because it's a compacted soil. So that's one of the other things you can look for. So that's basically what.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
There's a question, why doesn't water accumulate in lawn?
In a lawn? Well, because there is going to be a root system in your lawn that may be thick enough and healthy enough that it's actually allowing the water to kind of settle below the lawn system, even if it's compacted. The roots of a lawn are pretty numerous and extensive in terms of how far they spread out, not so much in how far down they go into the soil. So they can actually help to soak up a lot of water. I do know that most turf grasses are what we call thirsty plants. They do like to have a lot of water. So yeah, so they would take up a lot of water after a while. So even though you might have some standing water for maybe like a day or so, the lawn itself and the grasses itself are pretty thirsty and will absorb a lot of the water in there. So those were just a couple of things that you can use your eyes to actually see what's going on in terms of compaction, but the best way to determine if you have compaction is to literally and figuratively dig in. So you can take a shovel, a spade, a trowel, and you can dig up several small areas in your yard. So whatever you feel comfortable doing, if you want to check, different planting beds or the turf grass areas, or if you have a forested area and you want to check that out with some trees and see if it's compacted, you can do that as well. Make sure that you check a couple of different spots in your yard using the shovel or the spade. If you find that it's too difficult to dig through, that is pretty strong indication that you have compacted soils, okay? Especially if it's pretty moist soil, like a day or two after a rainstorm. So it's best to do this like a day or two after a rainstorm or after you irrigate an area, excuse me. So you want to do that afterwards. So if you're able to, unable to dig into the ground because it's just too firm, it's too hard, it's a pretty strong indication that you have compacted soil. So even though there's a little bit of moisture in it, you're still unable to do it. If you have pretty wet soil and you're able to dig in it, but the soil tends to stay clumped together, even when it's wet, it can be considered compacted as well. So even if you're unable to break it apart, even when you've got a good amount of moisture, say that 1 or 2 days after rainfall or after irrigation, it could be considered compacted. The best time to do this check is in early spring, which would be considered now. So if you guys are at home tomorrow and you have the time, I would check around a couple of spots to actually do this. So literally digging in to the soil. I see somebody asked, what about a pitchfork or some other type of instrument? You can do that as well. What you would have to do is obviously break off huge chunks of it to see if it's going to flake off, etc. So any sort of digging implement that you have, the big key indicator is if you can't get it in the ground, you're most likely compacted. So that's the one thing to keep in mind with that. But the best time to do it is relatively right about now with the amount of rainfall that's happened, etc. So I would wait another day or so, maybe tomorrow, get out there, dig different parts of your yard. You don't have to dig a huge area, just a little bit further down, to see if you have compacted soil. So you can actually check it out by actually digging into the soil. The other thing you can do is you can actually test by using some sort of probe. One of the things that we recommend is using like a wire flag, the type of flags that they use for marking off utilities in an area. So, you know, where your cable is, where your irrigation line is, where your telephone line is, etc. You can just take one of those wire flags and push it into various spots within your yard. And then what you would need to do is measure how far down it goes. So you would just need to know how far into the ground that piece of wire goes. You can also use like a metal skewer from like barbecue sets, if you know what I'm talking about. You can use a straightened wire coat hanger as well. Anything that's kind of like that thickness and that sturdiness, you want to make sure that you can be able to push that in the ground. And obviously, you can actually push it down in several different spots and then measure how far down it goes. If you're able to push it into the ground without too much bending, without too much trouble, by 12 inches or more, then your soil's in good condition. You can kind of consider it not compacted. If you're able to push it in the ground between 4 and 12 inches, you've got a little bit of compaction, or it could be a little bit of clay in the soil or some other factor in the soil that's making it just kind of seem fair. But it's not terribly compacted, but you know, you want to just keep an eye on it, especially if you're getting closer to that 4-inch mark as opposed to the 12-inch mark. But if you push it into the ground and it doesn't go in at least 4 inches, if it goes less than 4 inches, you can consider the soil poor and it's compacted. Okay? So those are just some guidelines that you can use depending on what kind of device you use to put a probe into the ground, whether it's the wire flag or a coat hanger, etc. So those are the numbers to keep in mind. Once again, we will be getting this out to you as a PDF so you can have these numbers, etc. When you're doing this and also when you're digging, obviously you want to avoid any underground obstacles. You want to avoid roots, you want to avoid stones, you want to avoid any utility lines. So obviously don't be digging near the side of your house where you have your electric meter next to or your water meter next to. Be very careful. So just make sure you're avoiding any sort of underground hazards. If you do hit a rock, I would just move the probe to another spot and try that one out. Like I said before, wait a couple of days after you do after rainfall or after you irrigate the area to just ensure that you're getting kind of like the maximum out of it. So those are a couple of ways you can actually check for compaction. The wire flag method is actually based upon the Soil Health Assessment Guide for New Jersey that was developed and published by the Ocean County Soil Conservation District. So this resource will be included in the slideshow so you can actually get it and actually go into a little bit more detail as to what it means. This Soil Health Assessment Guide goes into all different components of soil. So in this graphic here, you guys probably can't read it because the print's so small, but the bottom one talks about erosion. I know a couple people have asked about erosion. You can figure out whether or not you have erosion on site in addition to the compaction as well through this guide. So that's one of the things that you can utilize for that. So we know what compaction is, what causes it, what are some of the environmental effects of compaction, what to actually look for, what to actually dig into. So what can you do about soil compaction? So you do the test, you find out that you may or may not have soil compaction. What can you do? Well, there's two options you can take. One of the things to do, the first option is to actually reduce compaction. So if you do these tests and you determine that you really don't have compacted soil, before your soil gets compacted, you can be proactive and reduce soil compaction in a couple of different ways. One of them is not to use heavy machinery on wet soil that will cause compaction to occur. So even just a rider mower or even a push mower going back and forth multiple times, it can actually lead to higher amounts of compaction to an area. So wait until the soil dry out a little bit. Once again, 2 or 3 days after a rainstorm, 2 or 3 days after irrigating an area, then you can go out and do it. It's a lot safer for the soil. It's been able to absorb some of the water. It's not in that kind of sweet spot of field capacity that you'll actually compact the soil down. In terms of foot traffic and people walking in areas of your yard, you want to restrict or redirect foot traffic, or you can kind of line paths with stone, with mulch, pavers to actually direct the people who are walking back and forth to only certain parts of your yard that you kind of know will be compacted because that's the footpath that people are going to walk. So if you have a paved walkway, etc., at least you're having people confine themselves to a smaller area of the yard and not compacting the entire area except entire area affecting that. But one of the key things that you can do to help reduce compaction is to add organic matter or some sort of other soil amendment to help basically fluff up and add health to your soil. I know in a few weeks we're going to be doing a compost talk, so that's a great way to use compost, is to help maintain the health of your soil by adding nutrients, adding the organic matter to it. So by adding the organic matter, you're actually, helping to add pore spaces and alleviate that compaction over the long term. So organic matter is really kind of key to helping to reduce soil compaction. Okay? So one of the other things that you can do, and I know somebody asked it in the question, so they're saying, how do you feel about aeration? So aeration is one of the best things that you can do for your yard to help alleviate soil compaction. And you aerate the soil basically through core aeration. So basically, you take what looks like little wine cork-sized pieces of the soil and you pull them out of the ground. And what that does is it adds both pore spaces by having those macro pores, adds oxygen to the soil. It helps the roots of the plants grow healthier because it's got more access to the air. It also adds water to the soil by basically putting in these little channels that it can go into. And it will actually help have your plants have healthier, deeper, bigger roots to actually help keep compaction from happening, because they're able to break through it and keep it kind of like that nice fluffy soil I mentioned before. So core aeration is probably one of the best things that you can do for your yard. What you want to do is you want to basically do it in the early or late spring in your lawn. The number of times that you do it or how often you do it will depend on the type of soil or how bad the compaction is, if you already have compacted soil. If you have something that's very clayey in terms of your soil type, you want to do it every year. But if you have something that's a little bit more sandy, a little bit more loamy and organic-y, you could get away with doing it every other year, every 3 years, etc. So you could do it that way. But really, aeration, using core aeration, is one of the best ways to actually help maintain your soil health and to reduce compaction from happening.
Hey, Steve.
Go ahead.
Hi. So I actually need you to start the poll.
Okay.
Because I can't start the poll.
Okay.
So everybody, we are going to ask you some questions about this session, and we're going to get it started right now because Steve is getting close to the end, so that you can tell us what you learned, tell us what you thought, and so that we can improve for next time. So please fill out the poll that pops up once Steve puts it on, and then he will finish his talk. Thank you, Steve. Okay,
so fill out and listen at the same time. So I will open the poll, and you have 15 minutes to complete it. It's about 7 or 8 questions. So those are some things that you can do to help reduce compaction from happening. But say you go out and actually start testing your soil and you find out that you do have compaction, what can you do after the fact? These are some of the things that you can do. One of the things is you can mechanically break up the soil if you're able to. I know I mentioned before to dig up your soil. If it's too hard to dig, then it's compacted. If you're unable to hand dig or fracture the soil with a shovel or a trowel, you can actually use a tiller to do it as well. If you have compacted soils, you can kind of do it that way. At the same time, you can probably go ahead and add organic matter to it as a longer-term solution. It's a good way to kind of do that. The next bullet is basically what I'm calling the nuclear option. It's basically removing and replacing your topsoil. This is just that your compaction is so extensive, it's so heavy, there's no way to fix it, so we're just going to remove the compacted soil and put brand new soil in there. That would probably be the last line of defense I would tell you to do, but it is an option if you have the means to be able to do that. One of the other things that you can do is you can create raised beds. So basically just build raised beds for gardening or for landscaping plants above the compacted soil. It's not really getting rid of the compaction, you're basically just kind of growing above it. So you're staying above it so you don't have to worry about the compacted soil underneath. So one of the other things you can do is you can plant certain plants after compaction occurs if you're able to break up the soil. And then when you have the broken up soil and you add some organic matter, plant some deep rooting plants or some deep rooting vegetables if it's a vegetable garden, something like carrots. I lost my headphones. Carrots or some other tuber like that to help break up the soil as well. So you can plant after compaction, but you have to maybe do something else like break up the soil, etc., and add some soil amendments to it to help keep the soil healthy over the long term. So those are just some of the things that you can do in terms of figuring out whether you have compaction and what you can do to actually reduce it or to mitigate it after it happens. And basically, you guys will have this access to this resource through this presentation when it's sent out to you. But basically, all of this is kind of summarized in this fact sheet that we produced at the beginning of this year, along with myself, the director of the Ocean County Soil Conservation District, and the director of the Soil Testing Lab, Dr. Stephanie Murphy. So go to this website when you get this slide set. Look at this fact sheet, and it basically just goes through everything I just told you in terms of what to look for, what causes compaction, and what you can actually do about it. It gives you a little bit more detail in terms of the soil amendments. It goes into a little bit more detail about gypsum, which I didn't go into, but that's something that you can add as well to add basically structure and pore spaces to your soil. So this is a great resource after the fact to actually review and actually get out there and do it. So that is actually my time, and that is actually my talk. Thank you guys so much for paying attention. I do have a minute or two for questions if people have questions, but please, 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 if you know, with us being at home, if you're able to go out there and dig into your soil and dig into your yard to figure out what's going on in terms of compaction, I would say go out and do it, especially now that it's fresh in your mind with everything. So thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. I see there are lots of people who are filling out the program evaluation and letting us know how well we did or how well I did. Thank you guys so much. If you have a question or two, Amy, if you want to throw it at me, I can do that for you now.
Yeah, hey Steve, there's a question. What is the best grass type to prevent compaction? Tall fescue?
Okay. I personally, you know, I would say if you're able to do a native grass, that would be fantastic. I know there's been a lot of work with Panicum virgatum, which is switchgrass or panic grass. It grows into a nice, tall, what I think of as like a Midwest prairie kind of grass, and it has very deep, extensive roots. Numerous roots that can grow up to be about a meter long. So they're really great at, you know, going down far and having a lot of roots, excuse me, to actually help keep the soil healthy and to kind of keep those pore spaces going. So off the top of my head, that would be the recommendation. But anything that's going to have a lot of roots that go deep. A lot of the regular sods and turf grasses out there don't have very deep roots, and that's the way you're actually going to go ahead and have healthy soils in terms of compaction is by having deep-rooted vegetation growing in your yard. You have 10 minutes left on the poll, by the way, just to let you know. Any other questions? Okay.
Since you focus on compaction affect underwater tables such as drinking wells.
Ooh. So if you have a pretty extensive area of compaction over a yard, you may actually, it would have to be really extensive compaction over a large area to actually affect the water table or the amount of water that you have in your groundwater. Compaction isn't an all or nothing, which is why I tell people that if they're going to test your yard for compaction, you do it in several areas, because you need to figure out if there's an area that's not compacted, it's still going to get some drainage into it and will have water flowing into the groundwater system. So I don't see it as a huge impact. It can actually just cause the water to stay on the surface and not get into the groundwater or the aquifer. I usually see that more often if you have a layer of clay as opposed to compacted soils. But compacted soils, there is hope to kind of come back from that. So if you do some of the methods I explained, you can actually come back from it and not have an extensive system that will impact, say, your groundwater or your drinking water.
Okay, question in the Q&A. I wanted to know, how does winter plant heating affect soil compaction?
I don't know. That's my my guess is that when you have any sort of freezing of water within the soil or underneath plants, because water expands when it freezes and it's in those pore spaces, especially during a winter where we have a lot of snow and a lot of snow melt getting in those pore spaces, that would actually expand those pore spaces and actually help to reduce compaction. That would be my hope in the theory that I have in my head. Once again, I said before, I'm not a soil scientist. That's just my best guess in terms of the water side of it. And what I would expect to happen. So I would see that it wouldn't have a huge impact on causing compaction. It could actually have a little bit of an impact on alleviating it a little bit, would be my best guess at this point. It's just a best guess at this point. And there are 7.5 minutes left on the poll, so if you haven't taken the poll yet, feel free to do so. But thank you to everybody who did complete the poll.
Okay. So, question,
Sure.
hold on. Is there a way to carry out do-it-yourself aeration, or does it require professional assistance?
I would say yes and yes. Yes, there's a way to do it yourself. There are soil probes that are out there that will actually allow you to take out chunks of soil, like the little wine corks I mentioned before. I know a lot of the hardware stores and the big box stores, you can actually rent a core aerator. I recommend core aeration because it's the best proven method for reducing compaction. I know a do-it-yourself kind of option is to do something that looks like an extensive golf shoe. And basically, there are shoes that you strap to your feet that have these long metal spikes on them, and you walk around your yard to aerate them by puncturing these holes in. But you're also walking on the soil, so you may be adding to the compaction as opposed to alleviating it. I think the best thing to do is, if you're going to do it yourself, at least find the ability to rent a core aerator yourself. And it's all going to depend on how big of a yard you have, how extensive an area you have your compaction, the soil type that you have, etc. So you can go either way. What you could possibly do is do a do-it-yourself method and see if that works 1 year, and test your soil the next year to see if you still have compaction. If you still have compaction, you may need to step it up and go professional.
Okay. Municipalities address compaction as part of planning, development, and/or infrastructure.
Yes. At the end of 2016 or 17, the state did include soil compaction testing as part of the soil tests that need to be done for any sort of new developments that were going in. So new developments should be, if they were started or planned to be started after that time of that legislation being passed, including soil compaction testing, and there are certain thresholds that they need to maintain for both the stability of the structures that they're putting in, but also if they're putting in like a house, they need to look at the non-structural areas, say like the lawn or the backyard for an area that doesn't need to be as compacted as where the physical structure is going to sit. So there is legislation out there that planning boards should be aware of within towns, environmental commissions, et cetera, of this new legislation that is addressing soil compaction. So it has been a couple years, so hopefully people know about it.
Okay, winter heaving question.
Okay.
Does compaction cause the heaving?
I'm going to give you a possible yes, possibly. It could be part of that as well. If it's not allowing, there could be other reasons why the water is not draining properly and is freezing and causing the heaving. I would recommend that you do a soil compaction test, like I mentioned, either using a probe test or digging into the soil. Unfortunately, right now, the soil testing lab for Rutgers is suspended operation, obviously, due to the situation that we're in with the coronavirus. But being able to actually have them do a soil bulk density test for your yard as well would be another means to go, et cetera. So it could possibly be part of it, but the only way you can know if you have compacted soil is to go out there and look at it and test it.
Okay.
And 3.5 minutes left on the poll.
There's another question. How deep are the cores that the core aerator pulls out of the soil? Is that enough to accommodate grass roots? And what do you do to alleviate soil compaction in a layer below the top layer?
So the first part of the question, it all depends on the aerator, but they're generally about 3 or 4 inches long, the plugs that they pull out for the aeration. So you're really just dealing with the surface compaction. Even though I said at the beginning of this talk that you can have subsoil compaction further down, it is a means to help alleviate at least the surface compaction that's out there. And that actually, when we're looking at infiltration, is really the key. You want to make sure that the water is getting back into the ground somehow. So that surface layer and making sure that you have some holes poked in that to allow the water through is a great means of addressing that. When you have the subsurface compaction going on, that's a much more difficult situation. So as you notice, the means that I mentioned in terms of determining if you have soil compaction are really looking at the surface compaction, because that's really what you're going to have impact your plants. Especially that first 12 inches of growth is going to affect most landscaping plants and yard plants that are out there, as well as vegetable plants. If you have something deeper, say like 2 feet down, that's a much different animal. It's much more complicated. You would have to get to the point of like digging far enough down to know that the compaction's down there. And I personally would say there's kind of nothing you can do. But if you are, open to doing something about something that large scale, it's going to be a large undertaking in terms of like possibly replacing the soil at that point. And that's just like a huge expense and a big effort. So just that caveat and that warning on that there. So I would say mostly dealing with the surface compaction will do a good job of maintaining the plant health and the diversity of organisms in that surface layer to maintain a healthy soil for your system. Less than a minute and a half on the poll. Give you guys these warnings as we go along. Okay.
Can you aerate over exposed tree roots without harming them?
So basically, when the aerator goes over it, it looks basically like a steamroller with lots of little prongs coming out of it, or little tubes coming out of it, and those tubes kind of grab onto those plugs and pull them out, and they leave them on the surface. So you would run into problems where you would be damaging your tree roots if you were going over an area, say like that photo I showed where you had those surface roots growing. So you can run into problems with that. So that might not be ideal for those areas. And what I'm talking about for the aeration are basically those big stretches of lawn that you have out there. Less than 30 seconds on the poll. So.
Mechanical air.
Yeah.
You rake up the cores. And is it helpful to backfill the core holes with sand to improve drainage?
I think it all, obviously it's all going to depend on soil type, et cetera. But from everything that I've seen, it's basically go out with the aerator, take out the plugs, leave the plugs on the ground, and do not fill in those holes. Do not backfill those holes in. Okay? Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Steve.
No problem. Thank you guys so much for your attention and coming out tonight.
Yeah, and I sent some things in the chat, but just want you to know that these sessions are free, but we do have a way that you can donate to support our program. It would be amazing if you could donate anything. The donations can be made at the Rutgers Environmental Stewards Program. I provided the link in the chat box, and this funding would help support our extension volunteer program, internships, scholarships, and supplies. And if you do donate, please put Earth Day in the notes when you're donating so that we know what event you were attending. But thank you so much, everybody, and hopefully we will see you next week with our second webinar in the series. And thanks again for coming, and thank you again to Steve Yergeau for speaking today.
No problem. Thank you, guys. Thank you.